Now, the article I'm about to read to you comes from a fantastic book called A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, which is available in its entirety online on a website called History as a Weapon. And I'm going to be reading you selections from chapter 1. I shortened it a lot for my 10th grade audience. And this version has been pretty effective over the last 8 years that I've taught this topic. The next section of this book deals with the encounter between Old World, so European colonizers or invaders, depending on how you look at it, and the New World, the natives who were here to begin with. So this continues from A People's History of the United States, and we're going to look at long-term effects of Columbus and his arrival in the Bahamas. Specifically, we're going to look at conquests post-Columbus. So like what happened after Columbus? Starting to quote from the text here. What Columbus did to the Arawaks of the Bahamas, Cortez did to the Aztecs of Mexico, Pizarro did to the Incas of Peru, and the English settlers of Virginia and Massachusetts to the Powhatans and the Pequots. The Aztec civilization of Mexico came out of the heritage of Mayan, Zapotec, and Toltec cultures. It built enormous constructions from stone tools and human labor, developed a writing system and a priesthood. It also engaged in, let us not overlook this, the ritual killing of thousands of people as sacrifices to the gods. The cruelty of the Aztecs, however, did not erase a certain innocence, and when a Spanish armada appeared at Veracruz, and a bearded white man came ashore with strange beasts, horses, clad in iron, it was thought that he was the legendary Aztec man-god who had died 300 years before, with the promise to return, the mysterious Quetzalcoatl. And so they welcomed him with municipal hospitality. That was Hernando Cortez, come from Spain with an expedition financed by merchants and landowners and blessed by the deputies of God, with one obsessive goal: to find gold. In the mind of Montezuma, the king of the Aztecs, there must have been a certain doubt about whether Cortez was indeed Quetzalcoatl, because he sent 100 runners to Cortez bearing enormous treasures, gold and silver wrought in objects of fantastic beauty, but at the same time begging him to go back. Cortez then began his march of death from town to town, using deception, turning Aztec against Aztec, killing with the kind of deliberateness that accompanies a strategy, to paralyze the will of a population by a sudden, frightful deed. And so, in Cholulu, he invited the headmen of the Cholula nation to the square, and when they came with thousands of unarmed trainers, Cortez's small army of Spaniards posted around the square with cannon, armed with crossbows, mounted on horses, massacred them, down to the last man. Then they looted the city and moved on. When their cavalcade of murder was over, they were in Mexico City. Montezuma was dead, and the Aztec civilization, shattered, was in the hands of the Spaniards. All of this is told in the Spaniards' own accounts. In Peru, that other Spanish conquistador, Pizarro, used the same tactics, and for the same reasons. The frenzy in the early capitalist states of Europe for gold, for slaves, for products of the soil, to pay the bondholders and the stockholders of these expeditions, to finance the monarchical bureaucracies rising in Western Europe, to spur the growth of the new money economy rising out of feudalism, to participate in what Karl Marx would later call the primitive accumulation of capital. These were the violent beginnings of an intricate system of technology, business, politics, and culture that would dominate the world for the next 5 centuries. In the North American English colonies, the pattern was set early, as Columbus had set it in the islands of the Bahamas. Jamestown, an early English colony, itself was set up inside the territory of an Indian confederacy led by the chief Powhatan. Powhatan watched the English settle on his people's land, but did not attack. When the English were going through their starving time in the winter of 1610, some of them ran off to join the Indians, where they would at least be fed. When the summer came, the English killed 15 or 16 Indians, burned the houses, cut down the corn growing around their village, took the queen of the tribe and her children into boats, and then ended up throwing the children overboard. The queen was later taken off and stabbed to death. 12 years later, the Indians, alarmed as the English settlements kept growing in numbers, apparently decided to try to wipe them out for good. They went on a rampage and massacred 347 men, women, and children. From then on, it was total war. Not able to enslave the Indians, and not able to live with them, the English decided to exterminate them. Edmund Morgan writes, in his History of Early Virginia, "Since the Indians were better woodsmen than the English and virtually impossible to track down, the method was to feign peaceful intentions, let them settle down and plant their corn wherever they chose, and then, just before harvest, fall upon them, killing as many as possible and burning the corn." In that first year of the white man in Virginia, 1607, Powhatan addressed a plea to John Smith that turned out prophetic. "I have seen 2 generations of my people die. I know the difference between peace and war better than any man in my country. I am now grown old and must die soon. My authority must descend to my brothers, then to my 2 sisters, and then to my 2 daughters. I wish them to know as much as I do, and that your love to them may be like mine to you. Why will you take by force what you may have quietly by love? Why will you destroy us who supply you with food? What you can get by war? What can you get by war? We can hide our provisions and run into the woods, and then you will starve for wronging your friends. We are unarmed. We are willing to give you what you ask, if you come in a friendly manner, and not so simple as not to know that it is much better to eat a good meat, sleep comfortably, live quietly with my wives and children, laugh and be merry with the English, than to run away from them, and to lie cold in the woods, feed on acorns, roots, and such trash, and so to be hunted, that I can neither eat nor sleep." When the Pilgrims came to New England, they too were coming not to vacant lands, but to territory inhabited by tribes of Indians. The governor of Massachusetts, John Winthrop, created the excuse to take Indian land by declaring the area legally a vacuum. The Indians, he said, had not subdued the land, and therefore had only a natural right to it, but not a civil right. A natural right did not have legal standing. The Puritans also appealed to the Bible. Psalms 2:8, "Ask of me, and I shall give thee, the heathen for thine inheritance, and the utmost parts of the earth for thy possession." And to justify their use of force to take the land, they cited Romans 13:2, "Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation." The Puritans lived in uneasy truce with the Pequot Indians, but they wanted them out of the way. They wanted their land, so the war with the Pequot Indians began. Massacres took place on both sides. The English developed a tactic of warfare used earlier by Cortes and later in the 20th century, even more systematically: deliberate attacks on non-combatants for the purpose of terrorizing the enemy. So, the English set fire to the wigwams of the village. William Bradford, in the History of Plymouth Plantation, written at the time, describes John Mason's raid on the Pequot village. "Those that escaped the fire were slain with the sword. Very few escaped. It was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire, and the streams of blood quenching the same, and horrible was the stink. But the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave the prayers thereof to God, who had given them so speedy a victory over so proud and insulting an enemy." As Dr. Cotton Mather, Puritan theologian, put it, it was supposed that no less than 600 Pequot souls were brought down to hell that day. The war continued. Jennings sums up, "The terror was very real among the Indians. They drew 3 lessons from the Pequot War. 1. That the Englishman's most solemn pledge would be broken whenever obligation conflicted with advantage. 2. that the English way of war had no limit of scruple or mercy, and 3. That weapons of Indian making were almost useless against the weapons of European manufacture. For a while, the English tried softer tactics, but ultimately it was back to annihilation. The Indian population of 10 million that lived north of Mexico when Columbus came would ultimately be reduced to less than 1 million. Huge numbers of Indians would die from diseases introduced by the whites. When the English first settled in Martha's Vineyard in 1642, the Wampanoags there numbered perhaps 3,000. There were no wars on that island, but by 1764, only 313 Indians were left there. Similarly, Block Island Indians numbered perhaps 1,200 to 1,500 in 1662. By 1774, they were reduced to 51. Behind the English invasion of North America, behind their massacres of the Indians, their deception, their brutality, was that special powerful drive born in civilizations based on private property. It was a morally ambiguous drive. The need for space, for land, was a real human need, but in conditions of scarcity. In a barbarous epoch of history ruled by competition, this human need was transformed into the murder of whole peoples. Roger Williams said it was a depraved appetite after the great vanities, dreams, and shadows of this vanishing life. Great portions of land in this wilderness, as if men were in as great necessity and danger for want of great portions of land, as poor, hungry, thirsty seamen have after a sick and stormy, long, starving passage. This is one of the gods of New England, which the living and most high eternal will destroy and famish. Our final section, section 4. How do we evaluate the settlement of the New World? And again, quoting Howard Zinn. Was all this bloodshed and deceit from Columbus to Cortez, Pizarro, the Puritans, was all of it a necessity for the human race to progress from savagery to civilization? Was Morrison right in burying the story of genocide inside a more important story of human progress? Perhaps a persuasive argument can be made, as it was made by Stalin when he killed peasants for industrial progress in the Soviet Union, as it was made by Churchill explaining the bombings of Dresden and Hamburg, and Truman explaining Hiroshima. But how can the judgment be made if the benefits and losses cannot be balanced because the losses are either unmentioned or mentioned quickly? That quick disposal might be acceptable. Unfortunate, yes, but it had to be done. To the middle and upper classes of the conquering and advanced countries. But is it acceptable to the poor of Asia, Africa, Latin America, or to the prisoners in Soviet labor camps, or to the blacks in urban ghettos, or the Indians on reservations, to the victims of that progress which benefits a privileged minority in the world? Was it acceptable, or just inescapable, to the miners and railroaders of America, the factory hands, the men and women who died by the hundreds of thousands from accident and sickness, where they worked or where they lived, casualties of progress? And even the privileged minority, must it not reconsider, with that practicality which even the privileged cannot abolish, the value of its privileges when they become threatened by the anger of the sacrificed, whether in organized rebellion, unorganized riot, or simply those brutal individual acts of desperation labeled crimes by law of the state? If there are necessary sacrifices to be made for human progress, is it not essential to hold to the principle that those to be sacrificed must be making the decision themselves? We can all decide to give up something of ours, but do we have the right to throw into the pyre the children of others, or even our own children, for a progress which is not nearly as clear or present as sickness or health, life or death? What did people in Spain get out of all that death and brutality visited on the Indians in the Americas? For a brief period in history, there was the glory of a Spanish empire in the Western Hemisphere. As Hans Koning sums it up in his book Columbus, His Enterprise, for all the gold and silver stolen and shipped to Spain did not make the Spanish people richer. It gave their kings an edge in the balance of power for a time, a chance to hire more mercenary soldiers for their wars. They ended up losing those wars anyway, and all that was left was a deadly inflation, a starving population, the rich richer, the poor poorer, and a ruined peasant class. Beyond all that, how certain are we that what was destroyed was inferior? Who were these people who came out on the beach and swam to bring presents to Columbus and his crew? Who watched Cortez and Pizarro ride through their countryside? Who peered out of the forests at the first white settlers of Virginia and Massachusetts? Columbus called them Indians because he miscalculated the size of the earth. In this book, we too call them Indians, with some reluctance, because it happens too often that people are saddled with the names given them by their conquerors. And yet, they came, perhaps 25,000 years ago, from Asia across the land bridge in the Bering Straits to Alaska. Then they moved southward, seeking warmth inland, in a trek lasting thousands of years that took them into North America, then Central and South America. In Nicaragua, Brazil, and Ecuador, their petrified footprints can still be seen, along with the print of bison, who disappeared about 5,000 years ago, so they must have reached South America at least that far back. Widely dispersed over the great landmass of the Americas, they numbered approximately 75 million people by the time Columbus came, perhaps 25 million in North America. Responding to the different environments of soil and climate, they developed hundreds of different tribal cultures, perhaps 2,000 different languages. They perfected the art of agriculture and figured out how to grow maize, or corn, which cannot grow by itself and must be planted, cultivated, fertilized, harvested, husked, and shelled. They ingeniously developed a variety of other vegetables and fruits, as well as peanuts and chocolate and tobacco and rubber. On their own, the Indians were engaged in the Great Agricultural Revolution, or Neolithic Revolution, that other peoples in Asia, Europe, and Africa were going through about the same time. While many of the tribes remained nomadic hunters and food gatherers in wandering, egalitarian communities, others began to live in more settled communities where there was more food, larger populations, more division of labor among men and women, more surplus to feed the chiefs and priests, more leisure time for artistic and social work, and for building houses. About 1,000 years before Christ, when comparable constructions were ongoing in Egypt and Mesopotamia, the Zuni and Hopi Indians of what is now New Mexico had begun to build villages consisting of large terraced buildings nestled in among cliffs and mountains for protection from enemies, with hundreds of rooms in each village. Before the arrival of the European explorers, they were using irrigation canals, dams, were doing ceramics, weaving baskets, making cloth out of cotton. By the time of Christ and Julius Caesar, there had developed in Ohio River Valley a culture of so-called mound builders, Indians who constructed thousands of enormous sculptures out of the earth, sometimes in the shape of huge humans, birds, or serpents, sometimes as burial sites, sometimes as fortifications. One of them was 3.5 miles long, enclosing 100 acres. These mound builders seem to have been part of a complex trading system of ornaments and weapons from as far off as the Great Lakes, the Far West, and the Gulf of Mexico. Around the year 500, as this mound builder culture was beginning to decline, another culture was developing westward, centered on what is now St. Louis. It had an advanced agriculture, including thousands of villages, and also built huge earthen mounds as burial and ceremonial places near a vast Indian metropolis that may have had 30,000 people. The largest mound was 100 feet high, with a rectangular base larger than that of the Great Pyramids of Egypt. In the city were tool makers, hide dressers, potters, jewelry makers, weavers, salt makers, copper engravers, and magnificent ceramists. One funeral blanket was made of 12,000 shell beads. From the Adirondacks to the Great Lakes, now Pennsylvania and New York, lived the most powerful of the northeastern tribes, the League of the Iroquois, which included the Mohawks, people of the Flint, the Oneidas, people of the Stone, people of the Mountain, the people of the Landing, and Senecas, Great Hill people, thousands of people bound together by a common Iroquois language. In the villages of the Iroquois, land was owned in common and worked in common. Hunting was done together, and the catch was divided among the members of the villages. Houses were considered common property and were shared by several families. The concept of private ownership of land and homes was foreign to the Iroquois. A French Jesuit priest who encountered them in the 1650s wrote, "No poorhouses are needed among them, because they are neither mendicants nor paupers. Their kindness, humanity, and courtesy not only makes them liberal with what they have, but causes them to possess hardly anything except in common." Families were grouped in clans, and a dozen or more clans made up a village. The senior women in the village named the men who represented the clans at the village and tribal councils. They also named the 49 chiefs, who were the ruling council of the five-nation confederacy of the Iroquois. The women attended clan meetings, stood behind the circle of men who spoke and voted, and removed the men from office if they strayed too far from the wishes of the women. The women tended the crops and took general charge of the village affairs, while the men were always hunting or fishing. And since they supplied the moccasins and food for warring expeditions, they had some control over military matters. As Gary B. Nash notes, thus power was shared between the sexes, and the European idea of male dominancy and female subordination in all things was conspicuously absent in Iroquois society. Children in Iroquois society, while taught the cultural heritage of their people, were also taught to be independent, not to submit to overbearing authority. They were taught equality in status and the sharing of possessions. All of this was in sharp contrast to European values as brought over by the first colonists, a society of rich and poor controlled by priests, governors, male heads of families. As the pastor of the Pilgrim colony, John Robinson, thus advised his parishioners on how to deal with their children, "And surely there is in all children a stubbornness, a stoutness of mind arising from natural pride, which must, in the first place, be broken and beaten down." Gary Nash describes Iroquois culture. No laws and ordinances, sheriffs and constables, judges and juries, or courts or jails, the apparatus of authority in European societies, were to be found in the Northeast woodlands prior to European arrival. Yet boundaries of acceptable behavior were firmly set. He who stole another's food or acted invalorously in war was shamed by his people and ostracized from their company until he had atoned for his actions and demonstrated to their satisfaction that he had morally purified himself. So, Columbus and his successors were not coming into an empty wilderness, but into a world which in some places was as densely populated as Europe itself, where the culture was complex, where human relations were more egalitarian than Europe, and where the relations among men, women, children, and nature were more beautifully worked out than perhaps in any other place in the world. They were people without a written language, but with their own laws, their poetry, their history kept in memory and passed on, in an oral vocabulary more complex than Europe's, accompanied by song, dance, and ceremonial drama. They paid careful attention to the development of personality, intensity of will, independence, and flexibility, passion and potency, to their partnership with one another and with nature. Perhaps there is some romantic mythology in all of that, but the evidence from European travelers in the 16th, 17th, and 19th centuries, put together recently by an American specialist on Indian life, William Brandon, is overwhelmingly supportive of much of that myth. Even allowing for the imperfection of myths, it is enough to make us question, for that time and ours, the excuse of progress in the annihilation of races, and the telling of history from the standpoint of the conquerors and leaders of the Western civilization. Closing questions to kind of chew on. What was gained in the settlement of the New World? What was lost? And was it worth it? And then the bigger question, why on earth do we celebrate Columbus Day? Why are children taught to remember him as a hero? Seriously, try to find a rationale, even if you don't buy the idea himself. The man has a national holiday. There are reasons behind assigning people national holidays. Who benefits from Columbus being celebrated, and what message does that communicate? Finally, if this kind of history is interesting to you, there's a more student-friendly book that I love called Lies My Teacher Told Me, What Your History Books Got Wrong by James Loewen. Highly recommend.